So I think the interesting part is that sometimes it's not just the motivation around the topic, it's how it's living in the balance of your world and of your life. I
Mm.
think another aspect is that I can be motivated by an idea, but if the abstraction starts becoming disassociated from what I can physically do, what I can actualize in the kind of writing and experience and engagement, then it also becomes a little less interesting.
Hi, guys. Welcome to the show where we learn from the people who have followed their passion to achieve great success and have impacted many lives. If you're new here, then please do consider subscribing to this channel. This episode is being recorded in association with Let's Localize, the organization with a mission to foster micro contributions from communities and businesses to support schools for their need of time, skill, and money. To know more about Let's Localize, click on the card above or the link in description below. I'm your host, Ajay Mathur, and my guest today is an education consultant, a sought-after speaker, and an author. She wrote her first book in 2001, and then she refused to stop. She is on a mission to transform the way we teach and the way we learn. So please welcome the author of nearly a dozen of books, Allison Zmuda.
Thanks so much, AJ, for having me. And it's an honor to sit down and have a conversation with you.
Let's start. And I want to know, first of all, from you that you had been a teacher and then you became a consultant in education.
Yes,
So
I'm a little
what?
bit of an odd duck that way. So I
Yeah.
went right from the high school classroom into a consultant role. And I really believe that it continues to keep me grounded after all these years, because I very much have the mindset and the heartbeat of a classroom teacher, and beginning to think about what's possible from a systems-wide level, but also something that is powerful and actionable at the local classroom level.
But why did you do that? What's your why? What
Uh,
inspired you to get into this, take it so seriously?
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting parts is that when I started to look around and figure out what else is there besides being a high school classroom teacher, I wanted to stay very much connected and grounded to impacting the learning at the microcosm, the classroom level. But I also was not necessarily as content with my handful of students. And again, I'm using handful loosely. I pretty much had about between 120 and 150 students on my roster for a given semester. But I wanted to start to think about how can I start to impact larger classrooms and systems. And so to have that kind of top down and bottom up approach was something that I was interested in. And the only way at that point to do that was to start moving through the ranks of becoming more of an administrator role. And I thought that's not necessarily capturing enough of the creative talents and the interest and the imagination that I wanted to do. So the other part to launch that is I actually had a child in 2001 and had the opportunity to step back and say, what else do I want to do based on my talents and areas of interest? And that's how I sort of moved in the territory from teacher to consultant.
That's great. So most of your work is actually in how can we transform the way we educate currently. I want to know what do you think is wrong with the way we currently teach, not only in the US, but around the world, because education has got so much of bad press.
Yeah.
And let's find out what do you think are the holes in the current system?
So it's an interesting question, especially how you phrased it, because I'm stepping back and saying, it's not, I don't see it through a deficit lens. I don't see that education is utterly broken and we need to revolutionize it. Similar to the conversation that you had in another interview with Bennett Kallick, to try to really step back and say, what aspects of education are working quite well? And also really trying to monitor the tendency we have in education to have this kind of pendulum swing from moving in one direction, and after we get a little bit better with that, start to realize the limitation, so we swing right back into the other direction. So the interesting example of that is moving from a very rote-based curriculum to something that's much more project-oriented. And so the idea behind this is that in between these two extremes, we have to start thinking about where's that kind of incremental gray zone where there is balance as well as promise and positivity, and how we're continuing to tap the talents of individual classroom teachers to produce a more coherent system. But at the same time, what are the innovating pieces that we also need to bring into the curriculum so that it doesn't feel as dated as it currently does?
And you execute that by the use of personalized learning. Let's go a little bit deep in that.
Yep.
Tell us more about what exactly is personalized learning and what are the key elements of it.
So personalized learning right now has so many different definitions that I want to establish what personalized learning is to me and in the world and the work that I do. So the heart of personalized learning is the person, the human being. And so trying to begin to identify what it is that we're trying to grow in our students. And the idea is that we're growing through the lens of it being a progressively learner-driven experience. In other words, to grow their capacity to be autonomous, to be increasingly self-directed. And certainly, based on what's happening in the world with COVID, that's something that we continue to understand now more than ever. That's something that we have got to help our students feel more confident and capable in. That doesn't mean that they are left alone by themselves to do the workflow, but it does mean that they have an opportunity to understand how to self-manage, self-monitor, and self-modify their work, as well as reach out to people when they're stuck, when they're struggling, when they need a thought partner or a soundboard. So that's the first aspect of personalized learning. The second aspect is that students have the capacity to engage in challenging, meaningful, and authentic work. And to me, this is probably one of the most dated parts of the kinds of assessments and assignments we're presenting in front of the students, especially and unfortunately now more than ever, because there's been so much progress made in terms of designing authentic formats and tasks and experiences. But since COVID's hit, we started to step backwards into a more traditional rote worksheet-like pedagogy. So the intention of really trying to make sure that the work they're doing is substantive and it's very much reflective of the kind of complex, ambiguous, and volatile problems, challenges, scenarios, situations, and texts that the world definitely has on full display now. And then the last part is that they are working in service or in aspiration to the desired outcomes. And the desired outcomes sometimes are exclusively what the school has decided on behalf of the student. But I think that desired outcomes also come from the students and the families themselves. So the aspirations that I have as a human being or as a mom of a high school girl, the opportunity to continue to help her achieve her aspirations in conjunction or in consultation with what the school expects. So that's the basic definition of personalized learning.
Yeah, let's go a little bit deep in the self-directed learning, because that is what I was trying to visualize to how it works. So give us some sort of example to when the student or the learner himself or herself is actually directing what are their next steps. So just give me some examples so that I understand it better.
So there are a couple of different scenarios, especially as I'm seeing play out right now in our current COVID-19 times. So the first is the idea of what the teacher is presenting to the students and the families. For example, it's typical that they see sort of a week at a glance. So what I expect to have to do on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And the idea is that that workflow is potentially a set of assignments. So do this, read this, take this test, submit this paper. And so it's actually interesting because it's a very clinical view of a workflow. And one of the things that I continue to reflect on is perhaps the energy, the passion that the teacher has. Maybe it was actually present in that face-to-face interaction with the students in an on-site environment. But when it's stripped away and presented as here's a list of expectations or here's a list of assignments, it actually loses the magic and the vitality. So the first thing is that when it comes to inspiring self-direction, I need to be motivated as to why I'm doing it. We can start thinking about Dan Pink, for example, and what we know about motivation. It's not just that they're capable of doing it, it's that they are compelled to do it. There's a reason why. And that sometimes is missing in the self-directed piece. But let's say that that's there, or let's say they're working on a particular project, for example. I also know how to understand how to direct my time based on where I am in the process. So for example, if I'm working on a particular set of problems and I try to figure out the first problem in a math class, it doesn't matter if I'm in first grade or not, I'm in 12th grade, to what extent, if the first problem gives me a hard time, what is it I'm supposed to do now or next? And the interesting part from a self-direction point of view is that as a learner, my job is not to survive the assignment. My job is to learn from the assignment. And so to what extent are there scaffolds or supports not to give me sort of an efficient way of finishing the assignment, but to grow my conceptual understanding of the problem or challenge at hand, or potentially be able to hop on a quick video call with my classroom teacher so that the teacher's not doing the work for me. They're not leading me through it. It's cultivating my capacity as a problem solver based on a content territory that's troubling. So that's a second aspect of growing self-direction. The third aspect is really starting to pay attention to what am I learning from the experience. So in other words, I can make my way through the week's assignments, but I don't necessarily need to feel more skillful or sophisticated because of my endeavors. So to what extent do I have evidence of how my persistence, how my flexibility continue to pay off over time? What strategies or skills did I use? And in what ways did I do it so that I can choose to do it or not do it again? So self-direction really also has to have another feedback loop of teacher-student interaction. And how do we make sure that they're not just paying attention to the success on the assignment, but also their success in growing their self-directed capacities?
I think that reminds me of how did I get my education, and I have to confess that my focus was on the assessments and just score as much possible
That's
in
right.
order to just rank higher, and that's it. Really didn't bother to how much I'm learning. I mean, even today there are a lot of things that I mugged and I remember them and I've never used them because probably I didn't even understand them.
Well, it's interesting too, because especially in COVID times, I had an opportunity to take an asynchronous course, and it was something that I was actually motivated to do. And from a self-direction point of view, I was absolutely brilliant for the first 2 weeks. And then in week 3, for whatever reason, I started to become less interested, not because the content became less interesting, but I was less motivated. And by the end of week 5, I basically turned off all of the assignments for the course. And again, it was only for my self-edification. But at the same time, I started to think about, okay, if I was motivated to do the topic, what else was missing? And the part that I continue to step back and reflect on is that level of connection with a class, with the teacher. I think that's part of the conversation now on asynchronous and synchronous learning, to try to make sure that it's not relegated to a series of assignments or workflow. It's not relegated to watch a series of videos and then write a reflection. It's having the opportunity to bounce ideas off of one another, to feel some kind of connection and community, not just to the topic, but to the people involved. So I love having a conversation like this with you, because it takes something that is relatively clear in my mind, but to interact with you continues to open up new ideas, fresh thinking, etc.
I think you have touched upon a very important point here, that you were once motivated to do something, but over a period of time, you lost it. And that is not just relevant to the school children. It's applicable to everybody, even young people and the old people, because you lose motivation. And to keep it consistent is a kind of art, I believe. What do you think are the top tips to have a consistency in the motivation
Yeah,
for
so
whatever
I
goal
think
you want to achieve?
that's right. So one of the things about motivation, to me, I mean, like like it's a fantastic topic to talk about for an entire hour, but one of the things is really about the balance of your own life, and it very much impacts motivation. So as I step back and continue to reflect on that particular course experience, um, it was also at the end of March when the weight of COVID was beginning to reveal itself. And, over the course of that next several weeks, life became a little scary, a little more depressing. I spent not just a little, a lot more time sitting in the chair that I'm sitting in right now, to the point where I had to, I think I wore out one chair, and this is my second desk chair that's hopefully a little more cushy, so that I can continue to engage in conversations with educators and citizens and innovators like yourself. So I think the interesting part is that sometimes it's not just the motivation around the topic, it's how it's living in the balance of your world and of your life. I think another aspect is that I can be motivated by an idea, but if the abstraction starts becoming disassociated from what I can physically do, what I can actualize in the kind of writing and experience and engagement, then it also becomes a little less interesting. And that's as true for, again, a second grader as it is true for a teacher that's been teaching a couple of decades.
And does metacognition help in that? Because I was reading about it a little bit on your website. Tell us a little
Yeah,
bit more about it. I find it very intriguing, the concept.
so I think metacognition, the idea of really paying attention to your internal dialogue as you're having an experience. The notion of how do you continue to think about your inner critic, it is something that, as any kind of creative person has, that inner critic potentially can interfere with your ability to generate, to imagine possibilities, to think about the synthesis, the combinatory plays Albert Einstein so beautifully did. All of that can actually be drowned out by what's happening as you're processing. The notion of feeling like not only am I in the work in this moment, so I'm observing areas that require a little more time and attention based on the problem, the text, the challenge, whether I'm reading it or whether I'm producing it. But I think at the same time of really trying to sort of pay attention to that dance between an inner critic that is a helpful growth mindset point of view versus an inner critic that actually is tearing you down. When I played tennis growing up, tennis players have an odd habit of speaking to themselves using their full proper name. Do you know what I mean? So they use the first middle name and the last name. And again, you're scolding yourself in a way that actually predictably makes it so you perform worse. So when that narrative starts, it actually has a significant impact on your likelihood of success. And so that's, to me, another part of the challenge is just to continue to check in and say, if the inner critic is getting the best of me, how do I stand up and change my perspective, my point of view? Sometimes it's literally shutting it down and taking a walk and coming back. Sometimes it's deliberately sketching out a wildly different idea so that I have something to compare it to. But oftentimes I find that when that inner critic just takes a stranglehold, it is an opportunity to say, like, I'm not in a space right now to do my best work. So you try again a few minutes later, or maybe tomorrow.
No, this is really, really good. I had an interview, as you mentioned, with Ben Akalik and 16 Habits of Mind. They are working in combination with the personalized learning.
Yes.
How does that combination work? I mean, you've already given me an example of metacognition, which sounds super powerful to me.
Absolutely. So, I mean, so let's talk about one of the personalized learning elements is inquiry. And so the capacity to grow students' capacity to asking good questions. So the direct link to one of the habits is questioning and posing problems. But you're also starting to think about other ancillary habits that are very connected, like applying past knowledge to new situations, or creating, imagining, and innovating. Starting to ask the questions, what if, or how might we, starts to expand the thinking and the possibilities. So the interesting dynamic of how do we continue to connect inquiry that is very significant in a range of academic subject areas, but at the same time, really tap into what's fascinating, what's curious, what's intriguing enough that I want to actually pursue that question. So that to me is part of how personalized learning comes into play. So I can grow students' capacity to engage in questioning and problem posing, but I can also grow the capacity to actually seek out what's curious, what's fascinating, what's interesting, because I'm teaching them to move through from a more superficial line of questioning to a more investigative, complex, more sophisticated line of questioning.
Do they use these kind of techniques in Finland? Because I've heard a lot about the education system in Finland, and a lot of other countries probably have tried it. Does it not work everywhere, or could you?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it works everywhere, and I think the more opportunities we have to engage in global conversations like this, you can start to see the groundedness of timeless practices like the IB learner profile that has a significant emphasis on inquiry. Finland, for example, that is having a phenomenon-based approach as part of their curriculum. But I also think you can see it in other aspects of the world when you're starting to think about the notion of VUCA. So challenges that are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Not only that as a model for the business world, but it's also a model for the school world of how do we grow students that are much more capable of making sense of things that don't have a solution path already set up, that requires a different level of thinking than that problem or question sort of was oriented around in the first place. But I think the other aspect of this is how do we continue to hold on to a handful of priorities? So regardless of what the issues or set of circumstances we're faced in, what are the handful of skills and dispositions that we are all committed to? So to what extent are we committed to growing learners, growing students that can listen with understanding and empathy and to better understand someone else's perspective and point of view? That's something that I would hope that most people around the world absolutely would line up and believe that's significant and important. How do you measure that? That's a different kettle of fish. And so not everything can actually be quantified in a certain set of metrics, but we certainly know people that are very much available and open to listen, as well as people that we have a sense that while you may have the platform of speaking, they're not necessarily going to be moved by what it is that you're saying. So that to me is hopefully where we are now as a world community trying to make sense of education, so that we're designing learning that can be much more, again, relevant, connected, and inspiring to not only our learners, but also our faculty.
So all of these methods actually work quite well when you have personal face-to-face connect with the people you're teaching.
Yeah.
Going forward, you probably might have faced the challenges with the current way of working remotely, although the schools are started to open now, but there will be still a lot more influence of working remotely, and then there will be more and more remote interaction will happen now. So how do you think that all of these, like 16 habits of Bena, I mean, for my audience, if they don't know, I'll put a link here to what those are. How will they work in this current remote environment?
It's interesting because I also want to suggest that when COVID-19 is in our rear view mirror, there are aspects of remote learning that should continue after that part's over. So how do we continue as educators to become more adept at working with our individual students? See, part of personalized learning is the idea that students are the most underutilized or untapped resource that we have. And the interesting aspect of continuing to partner with them so that, yes, there are a set of aspirations we're all growing towards, but at the same time, how can I make adjustments to the approach that I'm taking with you as an individual student in my classroom in service to that desired end? I mean, the most masterful coaches do that all of the time, regardless of what sport they're coaching, to have an understanding of that human being and knowing what to do and what to say to continue to encourage their individual best performance, but at the same time, make sure that they're a coherent part of that larger strategy that the coach is the steward of.
That's interesting. It'll be nice to see the post-COVID transformation, which is naturally happening now without anyone doing anything about it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think one of the remnants is that there are some students that actually like learning in a distance learning situation more. Some of the bullying, for example, or the opportunity to balance a full-time job as a 16-year-old and engaging in asynchronous learning after they get home. I mean, there are opportunities where we can begin to imagine that post-COVID, who we learn, where we learn, and what time of day we're learning may actually open up dramatically, especially for our high school students. So the interesting part of trying to think through, in order to support that level of learning redesign, we also need to start thinking about the redesign of our grading and reporting system, so that grading and reporting has some kind of quality expectations. Things like a mastery transcript consortium or any kind of standards-based grading and reporting system is probably more along the lines of what would be needed in order to support that breadth of opportunity for our students.
Yeah, I personally think there shouldn't be any grading and assessments.
Yeah, so I think the other aspect too, and this is something that Benna Kallick as well as Heidi Hayes-Jacobs and I really spent some time on what does assessment look like, not just during COVID, but post-COVID. So I think some of the primary aspects of putting feedback on the front burner, the focus is growth over time of the student based on a particular set of skills and dispositions. Having learners actually be able to tell the story of their learning focusing on collecting work samples or artifacts so they can begin to identify from the beginning to the end what was something that was notable, whether it was notable because it was a significant accomplishment in the students' world, or whether it was notable because they got stuck and it's worthy of taking snapshots of that too, so that we're not just telling the story of the fact that I got a B+. We're telling the story of the kind of foundational knowledge, the kind of creative idea that I had. I might have sketched out something brilliantly. When I tried to put it in 3D form, it may have fallen apart, but the idea I had was fantastic and fascinating. And those are the kinds of things that you want to continue to capture so that students are much more the stewards of telling their own story. The idea of it being a hero's journey, that we are focused on being the ones that continue to be inspired and seek inspiration from others. And the idea of not just getting information and ideas from others, but contributing to that beautiful collection of knowledge and inspiration and ideas. And that's the world that we all want to live in.
And what makes it more interesting is that these things are applicable to everybody. They don't have to be students, because everybody is now learning, right? You have to keep growing. The day you stop growing, you're kind of dead, right? Somebody has said it. Anyways, so Allison, there's one question that I ask almost all my guests, which is, what, according to you, are the top 3 skills or behaviors that everybody should have in order to grow and thrive, but those skills and behaviors are not taught in schools?
Okay, so now I want to just say this. I thought about this question, so thank you for giving that to me in advance, because it was something that I wanted to spend a little time on. So number 1, and again, just because you asked that question that way, there are some folks that are already doing this in schools, but that's my caveat. All right, so number 1, teaching kids to ask a good question. The intention is that asking a good question is very different from a question and a response. So your job as a classroom teacher or the leader of a school or a system is not to have a response to that question. Your job is to start figuring out, how do I empower the students or the set of students to begin to understand the power of that question. So we know the difference between a superficial and a sufficiently deep and rich and complex. But when we hear that question come up, it's really the moves the leader makes to help the student begin to stay curious around that question. So it's not just the asking, but the pursuit. So that's the first one. The second one is engaging in civil discourse. Right now in the United States, we have an election coming up within the next couple weeks. And regardless of the presidential politics, I think the concern is there is such a level of polarization right now, not only within the United States, but across the world. And it's not something that's brand new to our modern era. It's something that has been persistent over the scope of time and place. So that to me would be the second piece, is that when you engage in civic discourse, you have the capacity to seek to be not only understood, but also lending your mind to be listening to someone else. So you care more about hearing somebody else's perspective, and you're giving them the attention and the energy that it takes for them to sort of share or explain their thinking, without it feeling like a competition, or feeling like you might be saying your point of view, but my mind's already made up, and it was made up even before I sat down. So that to me is that second skill. And then the third skill is learning how to generate and refine ideas, whether it's through the lens of an act of creation, whether it's coding, starting a social entrepreneurship business, writing a literary analysis. I think the intention of not just generating or coming up with the idea, it takes a different set of skills and dispositions to actually make it usable, make it coherent, make it connected to the purpose and the audience that really was the impetus of designing or driving that idea in the first place. So oftentimes kids do a lot of initial or first draft thinking, but they very rarely have an opportunity to stay with that idea and sort of navigate its twists and turns, which is just so fundamentally miserable and beautiful of the creation process. So
Thanks.
those are my 3 skills.
Yeah, thanks for sharing them, and I can totally relate to all 3 of them. Thank you.
Thanks.
So now that you have written almost a dozen books, and you are transforming the way we teach and the way we learn, what next? What's your vision for your future?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. You know, one of the things is to try to spend time on the big picture, but also think about the manageable learning moments or episodes along the way. So I've been very good at sort of thinking about this on a grander scale, but I think the idea of making it approachable, possible, something that every educator can see themselves doing, to me, that's sort of what's next. And again, I think about educator, well, I really think about learner instead of educator or student, because I think that's another interesting moment as part of seeing a shift in how we're approaching education. Education can happen when my daughter wants to learn how to play the ukulele and she buys a ukulele and teaches herself on YouTube. That's still a learning experience. And again, it's not better or worse, but the intention of really starting to grow the capacity of when we're interested and fascinated with doing something, what's the motivation? How do I persist? How do I stay self-directed? And what am I learning from the experience? So to me, really honing in now on learner, whether the learner is a group of 13-year-olds, whether it's somebody within the student world and connected to an outside set of network experts, that kind of thing. So that's what's coming up next for me.
Good. All the best for that.
Thank you.
Finally, how can people reach you?
Yes. So if you want to hang out with me, you can reach out to me on Twitter. So that's at Allison_Zmuda, or you can reach out on Allison@learningpersonalized.com. So AJ, I'll give you some information so you can add it to the list down below. And it's just been such a joy spending some time thinking with you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for your time. It was really interesting and eye-opening in some areas. And I really enjoyed listening to you on YouTube. You have some long conversations with schools mostly.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Everyone, if you are interested in this, especially if you are in school, so if you're a teacher or students, the content that Allison has created is really powerful. So please do check her website. I'll put the link below. And if you believe that this video has added some value to you, then please do consider subscribing to this channel. I will see you again. Till then, goodbye.